Hi, this is Jim. This video is about why musical intervals like the octave, the fifth, third, and so on, why they sound the way they do. We all know what they sound like, but why? And initially that sounds like sort of a silly question, isn't it just obvious? But when you start to think about it, it's actually fairly interesting. So let me take you through it. As a musician, we're used to the idea that we have some music, some sheet music, we play the music, and we hear the notes that come out. It seems like a nice closed system. And logically, of course, that's what's going on. But if you think about it at a physical level, we don't get notes into our ears. What we get is sound. It's just vibrating air. And if you actually look at a sound file, like here's a good example with just 4 instruments playing, it's a complete jumble. I defy you to tell me what instruments are in there, even though if you listen to it, here's a little excerpt. That's Brandenburg Concerto number 5, a little bit of it. It's obvious to you that, okay, there's a flute and a violin and a cello and probably a harpsichord in there, and you know what notes they're playing. So how did we just do that? And I don't think anyone feels like fully understand how our brains process sound. But some of the elements of it, a very simplified version is with the sound comes into our ears, it's immediately broken apart into its spectral components. That's partly our inner ear doing that, and then millions of neurons busy processing those signals. And then based on that spectral information, we have this basic library of sounds that we recognize, and our brain matches the two up. Say, okay, there's the flute, there's the violin, etc. And then once the matching is done, you can now get the notes. And then once you have the notes, you have basically a logical representation of the sound. And from that comes melody and harmony and tempo and so on. You're actually working with music. And all of this processing, which is pretty impressive stuff, is happening in real time as we listen to the music. And it's really a spectacular capability we have. It doesn't seem to take any effort on our part, but obviously we can do it. Now, to deal with intervals, I don't have to deal with all of that complexity. We're just really going to come down to the first part of the processing where our brain breaks up the sound into its fundamental harmonic constituents. And to give you an idea how this sort of works, let me just play 2 different notes. I'm going to play an A on this guitar, and then let me also play an A on this recorder. Now, if I were to describe those sounds, when I'm dealing with a recorder, I would probably describe that as a relatively pure tone or sweet or simple or something like that. And of course the guitar has a much richer sound, so it's more complex. Now let's see if that intuition I get just listening to it matches up with what we see when we analyze the sound. I'm going to use the Audacity program, which is in the public domain. It's free to use. And just take those 2 sounds, which I've recorded, and look at their spectrum in Audacity. On the left, you can see the spectral plot for the recorder, and it has a number of harmonics, but you can see that they fall off very rapidly. It's got a real strong fundamental and then rapidly declining harmonics above that. And compare that with the guitar, it's got all sorts of different harmonics going way out to the end of the audible frequency range. So yes, indeed, it is a very complex sound. And we're not just sensitive to the fact that there are more harmonics. The exact distribution of those harmonics is really important to us. That's why people are willing to spend good money to buy nice guitars, because they like that rich mixture of harmonics. So using this analogy, it's probably not a perfect analogy, but using this analogy between spectral decomposition and what's going on with the initial audio processing in our head, we can start looking at intervals. And to do that, I'm going to use a synthetic tone just because it makes the graphs a lot easier to interpret than using a real tone off a real instrument. Here's the tone. It's not the prettiest instrument in the world, but it has this nice simple spectrum. So that was an A220, and you can see that it has harmonics, but they fall off evenly, and there's only 10 of them. So that'll make it real easy to create different harmonic intervals that we can then look at. And just in case you've forgotten about basic music theory, the harmonics are all multiples of the original frequency. And so if we start with 220, we get the first harmonics 440, and then 660, 880, and so on. And those are basically built into any real sound from a stringed instrument or a woodwind or a trumpet because of the natural fluctuations of sound in those instruments. So to start out with, let's look at an octave. And so we'll combine A220 with A440, and here's what that sounds like. And here's the spectral plot, and it's pretty interesting. You can see that the upper note, which is shown in red, the harmonics from that note exactly lie on top of the harmonics of the lower A220. And I think this is a nice way to explain. If somebody asks you, why do we call all the A's on the keyboard the same letter, and all the B's, etc., it's a pretty easy way to explain it, because you basically say, once you play the lower note, you've already put into the air the vibrations for the harmonics in the next A above that. They just slide right on top of it. And so they really are the same note in that, from a frequency point of view, they occupy essentially the same space. We're thinking about it in terms of adding energy. The upper note basically just changes the amplitude of the harmonics without changing the number of harmonics. So that's the octave. The next simplest interval is the perfect fifth, which musically is halfway to the octave, halfway up. And it's sort of a little bit like the octave in that a number of the harmonics do overlap, although not the first one. So you see that it's a very consonant chord in that there are no harmonics right next to each other that are going to create dissonance. And there's actually quite a fair amount of overlap. Yet the way it sounds is much richer because we've added new harmonics to the mix that weren't present in the fundamental. And it's very similar when we move on to the major third, although there's less harmonic overlap. So a major third is 1/3 of the way musically up the octave. And again, you see some overlap up in the upper harmonics, but not as much as with the fifth. And that's, at least when I listen to the third, it doesn't sound quite as consonant as the perfect fifth. Now, let's go ahead and change that from a major third to a minor third, dropping the note down a half step. And it looks initially at they're very similar, but if you look at the upper harmonics, you can see that all of a sudden we start having two that are right next to each other. And this creates dissonance. And so it's a richer sound, but it isn't one that has perfect overlap in the upper harmonics. Some of the harmonics are starting to conflict with each other, and that's why we hear that minor tone. Of course, the ultimate example of dissonance is a minor second, where you've got two notes right next to each other on the keyboard. And here you see you've got a number of harmonics which are really rubbing against each other. They're very close, but not overlapping. And this is a case where, just looking at the raw sound file, you can see that close coupled harmonics results in a warbling tone because they go in and out of phase. The upper plot here shows the raw sound file for a minor second, and then a minor third is quite a bit more regular. And of course, if you look at a pure tone, it's completely regular. So I won't belabor the point. I think this gives you some idea of how we are perceiving these these tones. If you want to pursue it yourself, it's pretty easy to do. You can download the Audacity program. It runs on everything and it's free for use. And basically you just select a part of a sound you're interested in, either a pure tone or an interval or a chord, and go up in the menus to analysis, frequency analysis, and immediately you'll get these nice spectral plots, and you can really learn a lot about what's going on in your music by just using these great tools to provide a deeper understanding. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I would appreciate any feedback or comments that you might have. Thanks a lot.